Welcome to the Resilient Relationships Talkshow with Drs. Christian and Caroline Heim. We discuss the science of relationships and give you evidence-based techniques to help your relationship thrive.
Hello, I'm Dr. Christian Heim, clinical psychiatrist.
And hello, I'm Dr. Caroline Heim, Associate Professor. And welcome to episode 11 of our Resilient Relationships Talkshow.
And what are we talking about today, Caroline?
Today's topic is a look at finances in a relationship. Now, a bit of a contentious issue for some, but don't get your heckles up. We'll see how this goes.
Okay, so as always, we'll be sharing some evidence, some science, some stories, and some tips to help you on your relationship journey.
And today's evidence comes from our large study of 180 coupled individuals that were married 40 plus years from 24 different countries, but also we'll be looking at a recent article that talks about this topic. But I think we should actually start out with a little bit of history first. Christian, what do you think?
A history lesson would be wonderful. Let's see what we can do about our finances in our relationship in the context of history.
In the context of history, some surprises here, actually. Well, let's start in the 1700s because that's when we've got some of our earliest records.
Oh, I remember them well.
What, the records or the period? Time travelling.
The 1700s.
The 1700s. And a lot of this material obviously comes from some of the wonderful history that's been done on marriages. And this is particularly from Stephanie Kuntz's great book, Marriage, A History. So we start off in the 1700s in a representative example from England. So let's take, for example, a girl that's working as a servant and earning money for when she gets married, and a young man that's also working as an apprentice in a trade, and he's earning money for when he gets married. Then the two come together, they pool their resources, and they buy a business together. So this was happening in the 1700s. All right, so let's move up to the 18th century when around the Enlightenment, so there were a lot of more economic alliances and marriage was becoming more of a love match. So it wasn't necessarily as much for survival. So there were a few different things going in the picture there for marriage, but there was still pooled resources to a certain degree in certainly the people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Then we get up to the 19th century, and this is where quite a big shift comes because the men are actually earning a lot of the money, nearly all of the money, and they're in control of the money too. So they are what is known as the breadwinners completely in the marriages.
So this is a bit of a shift in thinking because there were times when couples were working together and resources were pooled, and it wasn't always that men were in control and men had all the money.
That's exactly right. And we have a bit of a misconception. I think it is from the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution and all of that. So, and the women staying at home and rearing the children and that. But no, it was a matter of survival. So
that brought in the togetherness. So it was a matter of survival. A couple needed to be together just to survive the economics or the biological realities of a situation. There was more of a togetherness, and it was the Industrial Revolution that brought about this idea that men and women were separate and there was income disparity.
Most definitely. And then we get up to the early 20th century. It's not until then what we see women starting to manage the money a little bit more. It's still the breadwinner of the male coming home, bringing the paycheck, but the women are starting to get a bit more educated and starting to go into the workforce. But it isn't until the mid to the late 20th century that we're seeing the idea of separate bank accounts and some pooled resources.
Yeah, and that's got to do with the growing independence of women late last century.
That's right. So now in our 21st century, there are some people that pool their resources and have joint bank accounts and others that keep them separate, and some sort of in between too. Okay,
so our research looked at couples that basically forged their relationships in the late 20th century, but they are surviving in the 21st century. And Caroline, what did you find?
Okay, so when I started talking to the couples about their finances, I asked them the question, do you have joint or separate bank accounts? You know, do you pool all your resources or do you keep it separate or anywhere in between? So 90% of the couples that we interviewed, and remember these are in the demographic of married 40 plus years, said that they have joint accounts, 90%, and 10% had separate accounts. And there wasn't really an in-between. It was just either joint or separate.
Okay, so that's very interesting right there, because being 90%, that's actually quite high. And I don't think it's reflective of what's going on in marriages today. And for that, we will look to the other evidence that we've got for today. But what were the specifics? What were these couples feeling like having mostly joint bank accounts?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because they were really strong about having the joint bank accounts and the importance of that. So you've got comments like from Malcolm and Jeanette from the UK that have been married for 64 years saying, "It isn't my money and it isn't her money, it is our money." Or from Albert and Claire from Hong Kong, who says, "My bank account belongs to her and mine belongs to him," says Claire. "We see it as a whole."
So this is a tension in the evidence that we've amassed, because what we are actually looking for is what keeps relationships together. And part of that, I believe, was having a joint bank account, a joint approach to finances, because this idea of togetherness is part of a joint approach to life. But I suppose what we're doing here is translating that into the real world so that we can include what younger people do, what more relationships do, what the evidence is telling us is actually going on out there, so that when people come together in their relationship, they can just have a lay of the landscape and understand how they can approach their finances to give their relationship the best chance of making it in the long term.
Most definitely. I just want to put in a little bit of a caveat with our study, though, because 16% of the people that we interviewed were poor at some stage in their relationship, or some of them right throughout their relationship, and 6% experienced extreme poverty. So that's really quite interesting, because you really are going to pool your resources when you're going through something like that. Obviously, we interviewed some immigrants like Ino and Tiu, who had just arrived in Australia from Estonia when they first got married, and they said with nothing, totally penniless. Or Olga from Paraguay, who saved for her wedding dress by not eating. So, they're going to be pooling their resources at this point.
They are going to be pooling their resources, and it gives us cause to pause and reflect, because gosh, couples coming together today in the demographic that are going to be listening to this podcast probably haven't experienced extreme poverty. Now, having said that, it was still a small percentage, 5% or 16% that had experienced poverty, and yet we have 90% of people pooling their resources. So still, pooling their resources was the way to go, but does that mean that this is the way to go today? I'm not sure if we can reach that conclusion. We'll just lay out the landscape.
Sounds good. The other thing that's very interesting, and I think this is probably the most significant finding in the finance question that we asked them, was that it was all about trust. I said, okay, so how do you manage that? And they'd say, it's all about trust. So Angelica and Graham from Germany and Australia said, it means trusting each other implicitly. And Lance and Barbara from Australia, married 52 years, said trusting the other person would never do anything rash with money. So trust, couples told us, was an integral part of commitment and the foundation and attitude towards finances.
Yeah, and I just have to agree with this, because the way that we're looking at finances through the interviews that we did was to look at how finances is part of the whole relationship package. And the whole relationship package has to do with commitment, communication, values, and what you just brought up, trust. And trust is one of those big things that maybe we're losing it in society. Maybe we're losing this basic trust that we have, that we can be together with somebody and know that they have our best interests at heart as well as their own. So what else did our couples tell us in the area of finances, Caroline?
Well, it was really interesting because some identity questions came up about how they find their identity through things. We had comments from Trevor and Sandra from Australia said, look, it doesn't really define us. It's just what we do. And then there's others that said, well, it's been a bugbear of our whole marriage, because money's been tight. Oh my gosh, the amount of times that people use that word tight in the interviews. So it was about how it defined their marriage. And what's really interesting with that whole idea of definition is one couple, Monty and Janine from the United States, said that one of their main values in their marriage was not hurting their marriage with finances. That was actually a value because they didn't want it to define their marriage.
Oh, wow. So they straight away saw that finances could be something that would harm their relationship rather than help their relationship. But you brought up a whole lot of very interesting things there to do with finances. And I want to talk a bit about this idea of identity, because whatever we do in our lives, be it a career or a job, we sort of see ourselves in that, and it becomes part of our identity. That means it becomes a way of how we see ourselves and how other people see ourselves. And when you get a pay packet or when you get money put into your account because you did something, you look at that and you go, I did that. And that by definition becomes identity. And so this idea of joint versus separate finances reflects the idea of joint versus separate identity in your relationship. And that's what makes it hard to handle. That's why Monty and Janine can sort of say, you know what, finances could hurt us because we could hurt each other with the sense of identity we have and the power that identity has through our finances. And I suppose this is the thing that makes it really complex and really interesting. How do you handle separate identity and together identity in the together resources that we have in finances or the separate resources that we have in finances?
It is such an important thing, and it is tied in exactly as you said.
Oh, it is. So just for fun, I just want you to find some more quotes from these couples, because this is the sort of thing that we're going to get into. This is the sort of thing that will inform our decisions and our trust in each other in how we handle finances.
Okay, so this is Francis and Wayne from North America. And honestly, I mean, they really have struggled a lot in their marriage. It's been a struggle, a very big issue all through our relationship. It's been a stress, really. It's been an enormous stress all the way through it. Stress, stress, stress. But I think we've learned to work it out. We're actually on the same page about it now.
So that's about finances. Oh my gosh. You had some couples using the word tight, and here you had the word stress, stress, stress. And this is a bit of a revelation because it actually shows just how much anxiety is provoked by the whole idea of finances.
Absolutely. I even had one couple argue all the way through the interview about finances. I'm not kidding. I mean, that was definitely the bugbear and the threat to their marriage. They were just arguing, and they were a cross-cultural couple. One had one approach to finances, one had another approach, and they argued right the way through the interview about finances.
They argued all the way through about finances. All right, so this really speaks to me about how important finances are to us as individuals and how it can actually get in the way of that feeling of togetherness in a relationship.
Most definitely. And they were trying to, sort it out there in front of me. I mean, they had other values too, but yeah.
Okay, so just through these comments that you've shared with us now, Caroline, and I got to say that's already plenty, we've brought together a few concepts. Number one, finance as tight, stress, anxiety provoking. Number two, finances as identity. Number three, finances as trust. And I suppose I want to bring those together because that's what we're looking at in relationship dynamics. We're looking about individuality, which is the identity. We're looking at bringing that together, which is trust. And then we're looking at trying to make sure that this anxiety-provoking thing called finances doesn't become a stress on the relationship. So, this actually comes down to the whole idea of a relationship as a together enterprise between two people who are unique but have shared values. And that's really what our Resilient Relationship interviews is all about, to sort of show that relationship journey. But there is also a transactional component to relationships. I do my earning, you do your earning. Now we're coming together to form a relationship. So what do we do with finances? So this brings us more into the real world issue of what's going on in society today in couples. So for that, I think we should go to that next study, Caroline.
Okay, so that's a 2023 study called Factors Associated with Couples Pooling Their Finances by Kruger, Grable, Palmer and Goetz. It's in the journal Contemporary Family Therapy. So this is a great study, actually, where they surveyed 636 married and cohabiting couples.
So what was the main finding? They looked at that question of whether people pooled their finances, they looked at whether there was separation of finances, and they looked at the couples that had something in between.
Okay, so in this study, 66% pooled their finances, 25% pooled some of their finances, and 9% didn't pool their finances at all.
Oh, wow. What's really amazing about that is that actually reflects our couples. If you see that somewhat pooling finances can be put together as pooling finances, then they get to about 91%, which is really quite amazing.
It really is. But that 25% of pooling some finances is really interesting too, because that's certainly, I think, more of a contemporary trend where, we'll just keep something that's a little bit separate.
Okay, so did the study look at who actually pooled their finances compared to people who didn't?
Yes, it did actually. Married people and less well-educated couples tended to pool their finances.
Okay, I found that really interesting because obviously, and I do mean obviously, the more committed that you are to each other, the more likely you are to pool your resources. But they're finding that the less educated people pool their resources more, reflected perhaps their socioeconomic status. But I've also got to put in a little caveat here that their evidence actually contradicts a lot of the evidence along the way, and that the finding of education levels leading to or not leading to pooling of resources is actually mixed.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so in other words, education may have nothing to do with whether people pool their finances or not. What they found was two-income households were less likely to pool their resources. They found that the higher the worth of a household and the more people were in a household, which kind of goes together as well, led to less pooling of resources. And you could kind of make that case that the better off people were socioeconomically, the less inclined they were to pool their resources. But that's in the context of more than 2/3 of people pooling their resources and less than 10% not pooling their resources at all. So perhaps society is not as different in the 21st century as we think it actually is.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. I mean, that is a big percentage, 66% pooling their resources. And when it's sort of, everything's got to be separate now, I was quite surprised by that. And they had an interesting background on the downside of pooling resources and then the positive side of pooling resources too.
So what were the positive and the negatives of pooling resources?
Okay, so the downside of pooling resources, they said, this is in their background, it wasn't from the study itself, but just their literature review. They said that it was time-consuming and complicated, okay? And they also said, because they were looking at couples that were cohabiting too, so they said that was actually risky because there were legal implications for that. So they were the two main downsides that they cited.
Yeah, but this study comes at the whole question very differently than the way that we come at that question. So our study looks more at togetherness in the couple and things like shared values and commitment and trust, whereas they were looking at the demographics of how much money was being earned, size of household, worth of household, and likelihood of pooling resources. So it's more a reflection of the demographics of the people who are doing these things, because when two people come together and decide whether they're going to pool their resources or not, it really comes down to the two individuals. It comes down to, well, what do you want? How much do you value the money? Are you good at doing this or am I good at doing this? Should we do it together? And people actually have these conversations, or if they share values, they may just naturally go into a relationship without having to have this conversation because they share their values so much that this question is already answered for them.
And so you're going back to values again, but you did say trust and you did say commitment. And they're a couple of the things that they looked at as the positives of pooling resources?
Well, pooling resources means that you are more committed. They also found that the more children people have, the more likely they were to be able to pool resources, because having children, that's a commitment. That shows commitment. And so it leads naturally into more, I'm going to pool my resources with you. But the question is not, do we have children, therefore we will pool our resources? But it's more, are we in a relationship that has more commitment? And does that make us the type of people who would have children and the type of people who would pool their resources?
Yes, and then with commitment comes trust too.
Yeah, so trust was something that they only touched upon because they touched upon this idea of financial infidelity. Financial infidelity is somebody, let's say, making a big purchase without consulting their partner. It's my money. If I want to buy a new car, I can do it. Or it's our money and we have to find the best way to use our resources. So this has to do with trust and how answerable people are to each other. And this is another thing that they put into their background, that people who pool their resources are more answerable to each other, which makes sense, because you're not just spending your money, you're spending somebody else's money, or you're spending our money. Whereas if you have that idea of, I earned this, I'm responsible for this, I can do what I want, there is less trust because there's less togetherness in the first place.
Absolutely. So another positive, though, is interesting. Less discussions and arguments about who pays for what. I found that interesting because there's less conflict. I mean, on the downside was it's less time consuming and complicated, but there's less conflict when they're pooling.
Okay, so that was in a way surprising, okay, because logically you'd kind of think, look, I'm going to separate finances from you. That way we won't even have to talk about it. There'll be less conflict. But the thing about a relationship is you are actually in relationship with somebody. Even if you have separate finances, how you use your finances is going to make a difference on your commitment to the other person. So it actually increases the amount of conflict. But perhaps it reflects the idea that if you go into a relationship with somebody with whom you share a lot of values, you're just the kind of couple that's going to have less conflict in the first place. So again, it's kind of a chicken or egg sort of thing. All that we know is that if you pool your resources, you tend to have less conflict. But that might be because you are the type of couple that shares values and would have less conflict in the first place.
And that ties into the third positive for pooling resources, which is that the couples that pooled resources usually used the pooled resources for more utilitarian uses over pleasure. So that ties in with values again, doesn't it? Totally
ties in with values. And it is a very interesting finding because you're answerable to each other. You kind of up your game a little bit. You kind of sort of say, no, I can't just do what I want for my own pleasure here. I've actually got to think of my partner, my children, the household, and what's best in life. And that's actually a very interesting thing, that being with somebody else can actually help you up your game, all right? That you just become a better person, whatever that means to you, to use your resources for perhaps the shared good rather than just your own pleasure.
Absolutely. I think maybe we put in a little bit of an exception here for some of those bigger purchases where obviously there's going to be couples that pool to get a mortgage on a house. They have to pool their resources to do that, especially at the moment in the 21st century. And maybe this is where the 25% of couples that partially pooled some of their resources comes in, because if they're going to purchase something large like a house, they need to pool their resources to get a mortgage. So that's where the pooling together works, whereas for their personal expenses, they're not pooling.
And what I like about this is this reflects that tension that we all feel in a relationship between being together or separate. Because in previous episodes, we've talked about how selfishness keeps your individuality, but altruism keeps your togetherness. So something in finances, which is not all or nothing, It shows it's not all togetherness and not all individual, but there is that in-between area where I have to keep some of myself because I have to be a separate person to be together with you. But I have to stay together with you so that I belong as a person. And that's where this idea of having somewhat pooled resources probably comes in.
And probably works too.
Oh, yeah, it does. Because in the end, you're not answerable to every little dollar that you spend. Sometimes if you want a sugar treat, you'll just go out and buy yourself a sugar treat. You're not answerable to every little dollar that you spend. However, the big dollars, you're probably answerable.
Yeah, and it is interesting because that's when they pool, there's not as much conflict. So I think that's a really robust finding.
Okay, so let me just say a few things that'll pull together some of the information that we've put together here, because we started off by looking at finances in a relationship and how to handle them. We're actually not going to answer the question of what you should do, because what you should do is actually dependent on your values. There is a trend in society to see finances as more important perhaps than they used to be, because it is more of a value in today's society than it was in times gone by. But that doesn't reflect you. So when we looked at our couples and interviewed them and their approach to finances, we looked at it in the context of what keeps a relationship together in the long term. So we looked at their values and how they negotiated finances in the context of their values. The other study that we looked at from 2023 looked at what's actually happening in society. And in our society, we have couples that are together for a long time, and they looked at those. And we have couples that have been together for a short time, and they looked at those as well, because they did a survey of not quite 700 people to look at what the associations are between size of household, who is pooling, who is somewhat pooling, and who is not pooling their resources. And the interesting finding was, it wasn't too different from what we found. That people do still see themselves as together in a relationship, which led to 90% in our study pooling their resources, and 91% in their study either pooling their resources entirely or somewhat, which means that there's only 10 or 9% of people out there that aren't pooling their resources at all. So that says something, and that to me says that we value our togetherness over our independence in a relationship.
Yes, that's right. And we've talked about we-ness in other episodes, so it is valuing our we-ness. And very interesting that the couples that we interviewed that have been married a long time, and the new study that's come out is saying, yes, they're valuing we-ness, they're valuing togetherness. I think, though, it's time to move to some tips. So do you have any tips for us today, Christian?
Well, it's very hard here because there's no shoulds. There's no answer to say this is what you should be doing. And for me, the really interesting finding of the study that we looked at is that it reflects our study that 90% of people are actually pooling their resources, at least somewhat. Okay, so let's get into some tips. And the number one tip that I have is there's no right or wrong way to do this, but it would help if you know your values. And it does help if you know your partner's values, not only in finances, but the values of how together are we, how separate are we. And on top of it, I've got to say, I believe this changes through a relationship. There's no right or wrong way to do it, and there's no set way, that it just keeps changing. And if you pool your resources, you are taking more of a risk, because if you end up separating, then you've got to separate all of those financial resources. But that's what a relationship is. A relationship is risk. You've got to trust somebody else. You've got to risk being together, being committed.
That's really good, because that ties in with when we've talked about values first, starting with your values and then adding the other things on top of it. Because so many people come into relationships, as they did in the 1700s, with that sort of approach, we'll pool our resources so we can get a business, or we'll do this. Finances become the uppermost in some relationships. Okay, well, what's earning power, and how is our earning power together? Whereas if you start with your values, what do I really value in life? And then tie that in with the finances, I think that's a much better foundation to build commitment on.
Oh, I like that so much. That is such a really good insight, because the aim of this Resilient Relationship podcast is to help the listeners out there to have a resilient relationship, to have a relationship that lasts. So rather than looking at the finance question first, look at the values. Look at where you're together in your values. Look at where you're separate in your values. Look at where you're growing together values, and let your financial arrangements reflect your values. So, yep, I suppose that's the take-home message. And the one thing that I want to add to that is just to communicate, just to talk about it, just to know your values, actually share your values and ask about your partner's values so that there's complete understanding. Because look, it's going to be natural that somebody's going to be better at doing the details of finances than somebody else is. There's going to be the idea that somebody else may be better at making decisions. But the value behind it is we are together in this. We are pooling our separateness into something that is together so that we can last as a resilient relationship couple well into the future.
I love that. And I actually love the word pool, because it becomes a part of it's a water metaphor. And you're all part of this wonderful big pool that you're swimming in together.
Yeah, I like that a lot, that there's something that is bigger than the two of you. And I know that's a bit of a cliche, but it's a metaphor to show that your relationship is not just the coming together of two people, but it creates so much more.
Okay, well, there's some tips for you to finish off with now. We've had quite a discussion looking at our study, looking at some evidence from a more recent article, and also looking at a little bit of history to give us a context of where weeness started. Couples started with weeness and then they drew apart, and then they're perhaps even moving a little bit more to coming back together again in this 21st century.
Wow, did you ever just bring up something really interesting? That perhaps before the Industrial Revolution, there was a whole lot more weeness in couples, that the only reason that we have moved away from weeness, being together, is the Industrial Revolution and our fixation on the wonders of the progress of materialism and technology. But perhaps weeness in our relationships is taking a bit of a hit because of that.
Yes, I think it is, Christian. Okay, I think that's where we're going to finish for today. Lots to think about, but as Christian said, it's up to you individually as a couple and your weeness and your values, and to contemplate that and work it out amongst the two of you. I mean, there's so much on the internet and everywhere that you can listen to, and even our podcast, but it really is up to you two and your values. We're so glad that you joined us. We'll be back in another month with another Resilient Relationships podcast. We have plenty of material online under drchristianheim.com if you want more. Listen to some of our other relationship work, and obviously our book, Resilient Relationships. But for now, we're going to say goodbye, and remember, your relationship is your greatest asset.
Isn't that interesting? So we've even looked at that from a financial point of view. You can have houses, you can have a portfolio of investments, but your relationship is your greatest asset because it is of infinite price. You can't put a price on a relationship.
A great note to finish on. We'll catch you next time. Bye for now.
Bye for now.